The most iconic motorcycle in American cinema didn't end up in a museum. It didn't get auctioned off with a certificate of authenticity and a velvet rope. It got stolen. Twice. And the full story of what happened to Captain America's chopper from Easy Rider is so strange, so painful, and so perfectly American that it almost feels like the movie never really ended. Because in a way, it hasn't. Hi, my name is Johnny, and this is American Muscle. What Easy Rider was and why it changed everything. To understand what happened to the bike, you first have to understand what Easy Rider was and what it meant when it arrived in 1969. Because this wasn't just a movie, it was a rupture. Dennis Hopper directed it. Peter Fonda produced it and starred in it alongside Hopper and a then unknown Jack Nicholson. The budget was somewhere around $360,000, depending on who you ask, which in Hollywood terms is roughly the cost of a moderately ambitious dinner party. They shot it on the road. Real roads, real diners, real people. A skeleton crew chasing the sun across the American Southwest, with cameras rolling and no real plan beyond the feeling they were chasing. The story is deceptively simple. Two bikers, Wyatt and Billy, sell a cocaine shipment in Los Angeles, stuff the cash into the Stars and Stripes fuel tank of a custom chopper, and ride toward New Orleans in a vague idea of freedom. What they find instead is a country that hates them for what they represent. The film ends without redemption, without resolution, and without the kind of catharsis Hollywood had been selling for decades. It ends with a shotgun and a fireball on a Louisiana highway and the camera pulling back until the burning wreckage is just a smear in the landscape. Audiences in 1969 walked out of theaters genuinely shaken. Easy Rider grossed over $60 million worldwide, on a budget of $360,000. Let that math sit with you for a second. It announced the new Hollywood era, launched Jack Nicholson's career into the stratosphere, and permanently altered the language of American independent cinema. Roger Ebert called it one of the key films of its era. It won the award for Best First Film at Cannes. And at the center of all of it, almost literally holding the whole thing together visually, was the motorcycle. The bike itself. What Captain America actually was. Now, let's talk about what Captain America actually was, because the mythology around this bike has grown so large that the actual build story sometimes gets buried underneath it. Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper came to a customizer and artist named Cliff Voss with the concept. Voss, who was also a civil rights activist and photographer, sketched the original design. The fabrication work was then carried out by a builder named Ben Hardy out of his shop in Los Angeles. And here is the part that should make every collector in the world wince slightly. The raw material for the most iconic motorcycle in American film history was 4 Harley-Davidson police bikes purchased from the Los Angeles Police Department for around $500 each. Total spend on donor bikes, roughly $2,000. Hardy stripped them down and built 4 choppers from the parts. 2 hero bikes, meaning the primary camera-facing machines, and 2 secondary bikes used for distance shots and the kind of riding that put real stress on the hardware. The Captain America bike, Wyatt's machine, was the showpiece. Extended Springer front forks that pushed the front wheel out ahead of the frame, in that long, raked, almost arrogant stance that became the visual definition of American chopper culture for the next 2 decades. A teardrop fuel tank painted with the American flag in red, white, and blue. Stars on the helmet. Chrome everywhere. A sissy bar that caught the light like it was designed to be photographed, and it was. The bike was not practical. Extended forks that length are not easy to ride. They're not stable at low speeds. And they don't handle curves with anything resembling confidence. Peter Fonda has said in interviews that actually riding it required real adjustment, but it looked like nothing anyone had ever seen on a movie screen, or anywhere else for that matter. It looked like freedom had been given a carburetor. It looked like the 1960s had been welded into a single object and pointed at the horizon. The secondary bike, Billy's chopper ridden by Hopper, was built on the same donor platform, but with a different personality. Lower, more aggressive, with a red, white, and blue stars and stripes paint scheme of its own, but none of the theatrical reach of the Captain America machine. Wyatt's bike was the statement. Billy's bike was the exclamation point. The flag tank detail is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it isn't decoration. Fonda was deliberate about it. The American flag on the fuel tank of a drug-running outlaw biker heading toward a country that would eventually destroy him was a provocation. It was also a eulogy. "This is what we built," Fonda was saying, "and look what we did with it." That tank is one of the most loaded pieces of iconography in American cinema, and it was hammered out in a shop in Los Angeles for roughly the cost of a used television. What happened during production? Production on Easy Rider ran through the spring and summer of 1968. The crew rode those bikes across New Mexico, Arizona, Louisiana, and beyond. These were not gentle shoots on closed sets with camera cars and safety protocols. This was Dennis Hopper on a motorcycle on a public highway with a cameraman in the back of a truck, hoping the light held. The bikes took real miles, real weather, real mechanical abuse. The two hero bikes were used for close-ups, interior character moments, and anything where the camera needed to be intimate with the machine. The secondary pair handled the endurance work, the wide shots, the long stretches of open road that give the film its hypnotic, floating quality. By the time filming wrapped, all four bikes had been ridden hard across thousands of miles of American road. They were functional. They were real. They were also, as it turned out, completely unprotected. The first theft before the film even released. And here is where the story turns. Here is where it stops being a production history and becomes something else entirely. Easy Rider wrapped in the summer of 1968. It was scheduled for theatrical release in July of 1969. In the months between the end of production and the film's release, all four bikes were placed in storage in a warehouse in Los Angeles before the film ever opened. Before a single audience member sat in a theater and watched Peter Fonda lean that chopper into a Louisiana curve with the weight of the whole era on his shoulders, before the reviews, before Cannes, before $60 million, before any of it. All four bikes were stolen, gone. The warehouse was cleaned out. No suspects were ever charged. No recovery was ever made. Four motorcycles representing one of the most important American films in production disappeared into Los Angeles before the world even knew they existed. The production had no insurance on them. I know. Take a breath. The prevailing theory, and it has circulated long enough and with enough corroborating detail to deserve serious consideration, is that the theft was not random. The bikes were distinctive. Anyone who had been near the production, who had seen the Captain America machine up close, would have known immediately that these were not ordinary choppers. The theory suggests that someone connected to the film's periphery, a crew-adjacent figure, or someone who had access to that warehouse, knew exactly what they were taking. Whether they understood the cultural value of what they were stealing is a different question. In 1968, nobody knew Easy Rider was going to matter. They were just four unusually beautiful custom motorcycles sitting in a Los Angeles warehouse. The theft was reported. The bikes were never found. And with that, the most important motorcycle in American cinema officially became a ghost. The long silence. Decades of nothing. The film released in July 1969 and became an immediate cultural phenomenon. And the bikes were already gone. Let that land. The movie hadn't even played in a single theater yet, and the most important machines in it had already vanished into the city that built them. What followed was one of the stranger ironies in American film history. Easy Rider spent the next 5 decades accumulating legend. It showed up in film school syllabuses. It got retrospectives and anniversary screenings and academic papers written about the symbolism of the flag tank. The image of Peter Fonda on that chopper became one of those photographs that gets printed on posters and hung in dorm rooms by people who weren't born until 20 years after the film released. An entire era of American longing compressed into one man on one motorcycle on one open road. And the whole time, the actual bike was sitting somewhere unknown. Or it wasn't sitting anywhere at all. Nobody knew. That was the problem. Peter Fonda talked about the theft publicly more than once over the years. He was never casual about it. He never did the thing where a famous person waves off a loss and says, "It's just stuff." He was plainly bothered by it in a way that never fully resolved, which, honestly, is the only reasonable response to having something that irreplaceable taken from you before the world even knew it existed. So, for decades, the story just sat there, frozen. The film got more famous every year. The bike stayed missing every year, and the gap between how celebrated Easy Rider became and how completely unprotected its most iconic prop had been just kept getting wider and more uncomfortable the longer you looked at it. The replica problem. Now, I need to talk to you about replicas, because this is where the Captain America story stops being a straightforward theft mystery and becomes something considerably more tangled. This is where hope and fraud start sharing the same parking lot, and it gets very hard to tell them apart. Here is the basic problem. Easy Rider released in 1969 and became one of the most visually iconic films in American history almost immediately. The Captain America chopper was on posters, in magazines, on television. Every custom bike builder in the country could see exactly what it looked like. The extended forks, the flag tank, the sissy bar, the chrome, the whole composition. And here's the thing that made the situation genuinely complicated from a preservation standpoint. Nobody owned that design. It wasn't patented, it wasn't trademarked. There was no legal barrier between a talented fabricator and a motorcycle that looked exactly like the hero bike from Easy Rider. So, within a few years of the film's release, people started building them. A lot of people. By the mid-1970s, there were Captain America replicas showing up at bike shows. By the 1980s, they were everywhere, from California to Florida, turning up at rallies and swap meets in private garages across the country. Now, most of the people who built those replicas were doing exactly what custom bike builders do. They saw something beautiful. They wanted to build their own version, and they did. No deception involved, no fraud, just craft and admiration. That part of the story is completely fine. The problem is that a certain number of those bikes, and I want to be careful here because I am not saying most or even many, but a certain number ended up being described by their owners with language that ranged from optimistic to outright dishonest. Language like production connected, or screen used, or one of the originals. Sometimes that claim was made in good faith by someone who genuinely believed what they were saying. Sometimes it was made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The collector market does not always bring out the best in people. I know, shocking. And here is why this matters beyond the obvious financial implications. When you are trying to authenticate a motorcycle that was hand-fabricated in a Los Angeles shop in 1968 from stripped police bikes and off-the-shelf Harley parts, you are working with almost nothing in terms of physical evidence. There is no factory serial number on a hand-built frame. There is no manufacturer documentation. Ben Hardy was not filing paperwork with the county clerk every time he welded a bracket. Nobody on the Easy Rider production sat down and recorded the specific physical characteristics of each bike in a way that would survive 50 years and hold up to serious scrutiny. In 1968, nobody was thinking about provenance. They were thinking about getting the shot before the light changed. So, what you ended up with, by the time Easy Rider memorabilia became genuinely serious collector money, was a market flooded with claims and almost completely empty of documentation. And into that market, predictably, walked a number of people with very interesting bikes to sell. The Dan Hagerty claim and the Portland Trail. The most credible near-recovery story in the entire history of this chase involves an actor named Dan Hagerty. You might know him as Grizzly Adams. Long beard, frontier shirt, best friends with a bear named Ben. That Grizzly Adams. And yes, I understand that the sentence I am about to say sounds like something I invented at 2 in the morning, but I promise you I did not. Grizzly Adams is one of the most important figures in the provenance history of the Captain America chopper. I did not make this up. The universe did. Hagerty was not just a television actor. He was a genuine car and motorcycle enthusiast, with real connections to the Hollywood vehicle community, going back to the late 1960s. He knew what these bikes looked like. He had been around the industry long enough to understand what he was looking at when something unusual crossed his path. That context matters, because it is part of what makes his account worth taking seriously, rather than filing away as another piece of wishful thinking from someone who wanted the story to have a happy ending. His claim is this. Sometime in the early 1980s, Hagerty encountered what he believed to be one of the original Captain America bikes in Portland, Oregon. He gave this account in multiple interviews over the years. and the core details remained consistent across those tellings, which is worth noting, because consistency is one of the few things you can actually evaluate when documentation doesn't exist. He described a bike that matched the Hero Chopper's physical specifications closely enough to be genuinely convincing to someone with his level of familiarity with the original. The extended forks, the flag tank, the overall proportions and construction details that distinguished the Ben Hardy build from later replica work. He said he tried to trace ownership. He said the trail went cold. He was never able to establish a chain of custody that connected the bike he saw to the production, and he was never able to rule out the possibility that what he encountered was an exceptionally well-executed replica rather than an original. He died in January of 2017 without the question ever being resolved. The Portland lead died with him in any practical sense because the specific details of where exactly he saw the bike and who had it at the time went with him. The Portland connection has circulated in Easy Rider research circles ever since Hagerty first talked about it. It has never been confirmed. It has never been definitively refuted. It sits in this story exactly the way most of this story sits, as something that might be true, that carries enough internal consistency to feel credible, and that nobody has been able to either prove or permanently put to rest. What the Hagerty account establishes, even if the bike he saw turned out to be a replica, is that by the early 1980s, at least one motorcycle convincing enough to fool a knowledgeable and experienced observer was circulating in the Pacific Northwest. That means one of two things. Either an original survived the 1968 theft and made its way up the coast to Oregon, which would be extraordinary, or the replica culture had by that point produced work sophisticated enough to deceive people who should have known the difference, which is its own kind of uncomfortable conclusion. There is no version of that either-or that makes the overall story simpler or more reassuring. Both possibilities just add another layer to an already deeply unresolved situation. The two bikes that surfaced and what actually happened. Now we get to the part where real money enters the story, which is usually where things get complicated and occasionally where things get resolved. In 2014, a Captain America chopper appeared at auction through Profiles in History, one of the more respected Hollywood memorabilia auction houses operating in that space. The bike was consigned by a man named Gordon Granger, and the asking price reflected the magnitude of the claim being made. This was presented as a surviving original production bike from Easy Rider. The authentication process for this sale was, to put it charitably, contested. Profiles in History presented documentation supporting the claim of originality. Serious collectors and researchers in the Easy Rider community pushed back with significant force. The arguments against centered on the same fundamental problem that haunts this entire story: hand-fabricated frame, off-the-shelf components, no factory documentation, no unbroken chain of custody. The arguments for centered on physical details of the construction that, according to the auction house's experts, were consistent with Ben Hardy's known work and inconsistent with later replica builds. The bike sold. I will not tell you the price did not turn heads, because it absolutely did. And here is the honest thing I have to say about that sale and about every other Captain America claim that has surfaced over the decades. Nobody has been able to say with total certainty that any of these bikes is definitively an original. Nobody has been able to say with total certainty that none of them are. The theft happened before the film released. The documentation was never created. The builders are gone. Ben Hardy passed away. Cliff Voss passed away. Peter Fonda passed away in August of 2019. The people who knew exactly what those bikes looked like, who built them, who rode them, who could have stood in front of a machine and said, yes, that is the one, are no longer available to do that. And that is a loss that goes beyond the monetary value of whatever those bikes would fetch at Barrett-Jackson on their best day. Where things actually stand today. So, where does that leave us right now, honestly? Here's what can be said with confidence. 4 bikes were built for Easy Rider. 2 were hero bikes. 2 were secondary machines. All 4 were stolen from a Los Angeles warehouse before the film released in 1969. No one was ever charged. No official recovery was ever made. Here is what cannot be said with confidence. Whether any of the bikes that have surfaced in the decades since are originals. Whether the Profiles in History bike is real. Whether the bike Dan Hagerty saw in Portland was real. whether one or more of the original 4 is sitting in a private collection somewhere, owned by someone who may or may not know what they have. Peter Fonda, in one of his final interviews on the subject, said he believed at least one of the bikes had survived somewhere. He didn't know where. He didn't have evidence. It was the kind of belief you hold on to, not because the facts support it, but because the alternative, that something irreplaceable was simply swallowed by Los Angeles and never came back, is too bleak to sit with comfortably. I understand that feeling. I think anyone who has spent time with this story understands it. Why this story is so perfectly American. Here is what I keep coming back to, and I want you to sit with this for a moment before we close out. The Captain America chopper was built to represent freedom. That is not a metaphor I am applying retroactively. That was the explicit intention of everyone involved in its creation. Peter Fonda designed it as a symbol. The flag on the tank was a statement. The extended forks, the chrome, the whole theatrical audacity of the machine was a declaration about what America was supposed to be and what it kept failing to become. And then it got stolen before anyone could protect it. That is not irony. That is not a coincidence worth noting in a YouTube script. That is the entire point of Easy Rider compressed into a single event. The thing that represented freedom disappeared because nobody was watching, because nobody thought to build a system that would keep it safe, because the people who made it were focused on the road ahead and not on what they might be leaving behind. Billy and Wyatt didn't make it to Mardi Gras. The bikes didn't make it out of that warehouse. And 56 years later, somewhere in America, one or more of them might be sitting in a garage or a storage unit or a private collection, unrecognized or deliberately hidden, waiting for someone to care enough to go find them. If that someone is watching this right now, the comment section is wide open. I am not even a little bit joking. That's the story of Captain America's chopper from Easy Rider. If this one hit different for you, and I think it did, drop a comment below and tell me what you think happened to those bikes. Do you think one survived? Do you think the Portland lead was real? Do you think something is sitting in a private collection right now with a flag tank and extended forks and no idea how famous it is? Hit the like button, subscribe to American Muscle, and share this one with someone who needs to know the story. We go where the bikes and the cars and the machines go, and sometimes the trail goes cold, but we never stop following it. I'm Johnny. I'll see you in the next one.